November 6, 1956. British paratroopers stand victorious in Port Said. The Suez Canal arteries of empire secured in 48 hours. Prime Minister Anthony Eden receives congratulations from Conservative MPs. The BBC announces, Britain has restored order in Egypt. Photographs show Union Jacks flying over captured Egyptian positions. This is the image of imperial power reasserted. This is what victory looks like. But in a sealed room at the Treasury, three men stare at a different kind of document. Not a battle map, a balance sheet. It shows Britain burning through $45 million per day. It shows sterling reserves hemorrhaging like a severed artery. It shows 2 weeks, 14 days until the pound collapses and the nation defaults. And it shows one final number, the $3 billion in British government bonds that the United States Treasury is threatening to dump onto the market. The weapon that will crash the currency. The phone call is coming. Eisenhower will make Britain choose, withdraw from Suez or watch her economy die in real time. Victory isn't the cure. Victory is the virus that just killed the British Empire. To understand how a military victory became a financial execution, you need to see what Britain actually was in 1956. On paper, it looked like a great power. The British Empire still covered a quarter of the Earth's land surface. The sterling area, a monetary zone linking 50 nations and 2 billion people, made London the financial hub for half the world's trade. British troops garrisoned bases from Singapore to Cyprus, from Kenya to Hong Kong. The Royal Navy patrolled 3 oceans. Britain held a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Britain possessed nuclear weapons. But here's what the balance sheet showed. World War II had cost Britain $31 billion, roughly $400 billion in today's money. The war that saved civilization had bankrupted the nation that won it. In 1946, Britain went to Washington begging for a loan. America agreed, $3.75 billion at 2% interest. The poison was in the terms. The loan required immediate sterling convertibility, meaning anyone holding pounds could exchange them for dollars at a fixed rate. Within 6 weeks of convertibility, Britain lost $1 billion in reserves. The program collapsed. Rationing introduced during the war continued for another 8 years. Then came Bretton Woods. The 1944 agreement that rebuilt the global financial system placed the dollar at the center. Every currency would peg to the dollar. The dollar would peg to gold. Britain's pound sterling, once the world's reserve currency, became a satellite orbiting the American sun. By 1956, Britain's total foreign exchange reserves stood at around $2.8 billion. Its total external debts exceeded $30 billion. The mathematics were brutal. To maintain the sterling area, Britain needed dollars to buy oil, wheat, machinery, everything the empire consumed. But Britain earned its money in pounds, not dollars. The empire was a Ponzi scheme running on colonial tribute and American credit lines. Defense spending consumed 10% of GDP, double the American ratio. Maintaining bases in 40 countries. Fighting colonial wars in Malaya, Kenya, Cyprus. Projecting power Britain could no longer afford. The conservative government believed prestige and economic reality could coexist. They believed you could act like a superpower while borrowing like a beggar. They believed the Americans would never dare attack the currency of their most important ally. They were wrong, and Suez was about to teach them exactly how wrong. July 26, 1956. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser stands before a crowd in Alexandria and announces the nationalization of the Suez Canal, the waterway connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. The shortcut between Europe and Asia is now Egyptian property. 120 million tons of cargo pass through this canal every year. 2/3 of Europe's oil flows through this 100-mile ditch. Britain owns 44% of the Suez Canal Company shares. France owns the rest. Nasser just seized the jugular vein of European commerce. Anthony Eden watches the speech on television and sees something no one else does. He sees Hitler. He sees Munich. He sees 1938, when Chamberlain appeased a dictator and doomed a continent. Eden, the diplomat who resigned in protest over appeasement, will not repeat history's mistake. He will act. Between August and October, a conspiracy forms. The Protocol of Sèvres, a secret agreement signed in a French villa. Britain, France, and Israel plot a coordinated war. Israel will invade Egypt through the Sinai. Britain and France will demand both sides withdraw from the Canal Zone. When Egypt refuses, Anglo-French forces will intervene as peacekeepers to protect the waterway. It's a Victorian colonial war dressed in Cold War costume. Operation Musketeer assembles the force, 45,000 British and French troops, 100 warships, 500 aircraft. The logistics chain stretches from Malta to Cyprus. October 29th, Israel strikes. Israeli forces slice through the Sinai in 96 hours. October 30th, Britain and France issue their ultimatum. Nasser rejects it. October 31st, British bombers destroy the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. November 5th, British and French paratroopers drop into Port Said. November 6th, armored columns push into the city. Egyptian resistance crumbles. Within 48 hours, Allied forces control Port Said and are advancing down the canal. The military operation is a textbook success. Minimal Allied casualties. The Egyptian forces routed. The canal will be back under Western control within days. Eden addresses Parliament. We have acted to restore international order. Conservative MPs cheer. The press prints headlines about British resolve. This is the glory. This is the triumph. But here's what those headlines don't show. The Treasury is hemorrhaging $300 million per month. Sterling reserves are dropping by $45 million every single day. Oil imports from Saudi Arabia cut off in retaliation force Britain to ration fuel again. The United Nations General Assembly votes 64-5 to condemn the invasion. The Soviet Union threatens rocket attacks on London and Paris. Eisenhower, furious that Britain launched a war during the final week of his re-election campaign, faces a choice: support Britain and legitimize colonial aggression in front of the entire developing world, or break Britain and prove America is a different kind of superpower. He chooses option 2. The U.S. Treasury begins selling pounds on the open market. Sterling starts to freefall. Harold Macmillan, the Chancellor of the Exchequer who supported the war, receives the report from his staff. Britain has $2.8 billion in reserves. If the run on sterling continues, those reserves will be gone in 2 weeks. The IMF could provide emergency support, but the IMF is controlled by the United States, and Eisenhower has already told the IMF to deny Britain any assistance until British troops withdraw. Macmillan does the math. Every day British forces remain in Egypt costs $45 million in hemorrhaging reserves. The war Britain can win militarily will bankrupt the nation financially. On November 6, the same day British troops consolidate their hold on Port Said, Macmillan walks into the cabinet room and tells Eden the truth. We have 2 weeks of solvency left. America will not save us. We must withdraw or face national bankruptcy. The victory in Port Said is meaningless. The tanks rolling through Egyptian streets are rolling over Britain's economic corpse. The empire just won a battle and lost its future in the same breath. November 5, 1956. 10 Downing Street. Anthony Eden sits in his study, exhausted from weeks of crisis management. British forces are winning in Egypt. Port Said is secured. The canal will be under Allied control within 72 hours. Then the phone rings. It's the American ambassador. President Eisenhower wants to speak directly. Eden picks up, expecting negotiation. What he gets is an execution notice. Eisenhower's voice is cold, clinical, utterly devoid of diplomatic warmth. You lied to us, Anthony. You launched a war without consultation. You colluded with the French and Israelis behind our backs, and now you expect American support? Eden tries to explain the strategic importance of the canal, the threat of Soviet influence in the Middle East, the necessity of acting before Nasser becomes another Hitler. Eisenhower cuts him off. Here's what's going to happen. The United States Treasury holds $3 billion in British government bonds. If you do not announce a ceasefire within 24 hours, we will dump those bonds onto the open market. Your pound will collapse. Your economy will enter freefall, and we will veto any IMF assistance. This is not a bluff. This is not a negotiation. This is a financial neutron bomb with a 24-hour fuse. Eden hangs up and immediately calls an emergency cabinet meeting. Harold Macmillan, the Chancellor, who days earlier championed the war, now presents the arithmetic of annihilation. Britain's foreign exchange reserves, $2.8 billion. Current burn rate, $45 million per day. Sterling convertibility obligations, Any holder of pounds can demand dollars at the fixed rate. If America dumps $3 billion in UK bonds, it triggers a stampede. Every central bank, every institution, every speculator will dump sterling simultaneously. The reserves will evaporate in less than 14 days. Without reserves, Britain cannot import oil. Without oil, the economy stops. No fuel for trucks, no heating for homes, no power for factories. Rationing will return, but worse than the war years. And there's another problem. Saudi Arabia has already imposed an oil embargo in solidarity with Egypt. Britain's fuel stocks will run dry in 6 weeks, even without a financial collapse. The Americans control the alternative supply oil from Texas and Venezuela. Eisenhower has made clear, no withdrawal, no oil. Selwyn Lloyd, the Foreign Secretary, tries to find alternatives. What if we appeal to the Commonwealth? Canada has already condemned the invasion. Australia is hedging. India is openly hostile. What about the IMF? American veto? What about devaluing the pound to ease pressure? That would destroy the sterling area. Overnight 50 nations would abandon the pound and switch to dollars. What about appealing to the British people, rallying national support? With what fuel will they drive to work? With what money will they heat their homes when reserves are gone? R.A. Butler, the Home Secretary, speaks the truth everyone is avoiding. We are not choosing between victory and defeat in Egypt. We are choosing between withdrawal and national bankruptcy, between humiliation and annihilation. The meeting stretches past midnight. Eden keeps returning to the same argument. We cannot reward aggression. We cannot appease dictators. Macmillan finally breaks. Prime Minister, we won the war. We defeated Germany. We saved civilization, and it bankrupted us. We have been living on American credit for 11 years. That credit has just been called in. We can keep our troops in Port Said and watch the pound collapse. Or we can withdraw and preserve what's left of our economy. Those are the only options. November 6, 1956, 18 hours after Eisenhower's ultimatum, Britain announces a ceasefire. The war that was won in 48 hours is over in 72. By November 7th, the UN demands full withdrawal. By December 3rd, British forces begin evacuating. By December 22nd, the last British soldier leaves Egyptian soil. The Suez Canal remains under Egyptian control. Nasser becomes a hero throughout the Arab world. Soviet influence in the Middle East expands exactly as Eden feared, and Britain learns the fundamental law of the post-war order. Military power without financial independence is theater. Eisenhower didn't need to send troops to defeat Britain. He didn't need to fire a shot. He just needed to threaten the bond sale. The empire died on a phone call, killed by a spreadsheet. To understand how Britain could win militarily yet lose financially, you need a different kind of story. Imagine a man, Lord Haverstock, who inherits a £50 million estate, 3,000 acres, a Georgian manor with 40 rooms, priceless art collection, staff of 20. On paper, Lord Haverstock is immensely wealthy. In reality, he has £3 in his bank account. The estate generates no income. The art cannot be sold without destroying the family legacy. The land is entailed, legally bound to future generations, but the manor requires £10,000 per month in maintenance, heating, repairs, staff salaries, property taxes. Lord Haverstock borrows from the bank to cover costs. Every month, he goes deeper into debt. The bank doesn't foreclose because the collateral is magnificent, but they raise interest rates. Now he's borrowing to pay interest on previous borrowing. One day, the roof needs urgent repairs. £50,000. Lord Haverstock doesn't have it. He borrows more. The debt compounds. Eventually, the bank says, liquidate assets or we foreclose. Lord Haverstock refuses. I am a peer of the realm. This estate has been in my family for 300 years. I will not be the one who destroys our legacy. The bank calls the debt. Lord Haverstock loses everything. This is Britain in 1956. Now let's translate the analogy into mechanics. The pound sterling was a reserve currency, meaning other nations held pounds as savings, just as they held dollars or gold. the sterling area linked 50 countries in a monetary zone where the pound was the dominant currency. This gave Britain enormous prestige. It also created a lethal trap. Here's how the trap worked. Countries in the sterling area earned pounds through trade with Britain. They deposited those pounds in London banks. Those deposits were Britain's external liabilities debts owed to foreigners. By 1956, those liabilities exceeded £10 billion. But Britain's foreign exchange reserves, the dollars and gold available to back those pounds, totaled only about £1 billion, a 10-to-1 mismatch. This worked as long as everyone believed in the pound's stability. But if confidence cracked, if countries started demanding their pounds be converted to dollars, Britain would run out of reserves in weeks. Now add the second layer of the trap. Britain needed to import massive quantities of goods it couldn't produce domestically. Oil from the Middle East, wheat from Canada and Argentina, machinery from America. These imports had to be paid for in dollars, not pounds. But Britain earned most of its money in pounds from sterling area trade. So Britain constantly needed to acquire dollars. The only way to get dollars was to export goods to America or dollar zone countries, or borrow dollars. Britain's export economy was weak, damaged by the war. So Britain borrowed from America, from the IMF, from international markets. Every borrowed dollar increased Britain's external debt. Every pound of debt required interest, payments to pay in dollars Britain didn't have. By 1956, Britain was spending 10% of GDP on defense. America spent about 5%. France spent about 7%. Why was Britain spending double? Because it was garrisoning an empire it could no longer afford. 40,000 troops in Germany, 35,000 in Malaya fighting communist insurgents, 20,000 in Kenya crushing the Mau Mau rebellion, 15,000 in Cyprus battling Greek independence fighters, naval bases in Singapore, Malta, Aden, Gibraltar, air bases across Africa and Asia. Each base required dollars for equipment, fuel, supplies. Each colonial war drained reserves. The Malayan emergency alone cost Britain £300 million over 12 years. And here's the ultimate paradox. Britain couldn't abandon the sterling area without destroying the pound. If Britain withdrew from empire, 50 nations would dump their sterling reserves and switch to dollars. The resulting sell-off would crash the currency, but Britain couldn't afford to maintain the empire. Every year of imperial defense drained the reserves necessary to back the currency. Britain was trapped in a doom loop: maintain the empire and bleed reserves, abandon the empire and trigger a currency collapse. There was no good option. Only slow death or fast death. Now add the Bretton Woods system. In 1944, America designed a new global financial architecture. The dollar would be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency would peg to the dollar at fixed rates. Countries could adjust their pegs only with IMF approval. For Britain, this meant the pound was locked at $2.8 per pound. If Britain devalued without permission, it would be seen as cheating, violating the rules of the international system. If Britain maintained an overvalued pound, its exports became expensive and uncompetitive. Britain was trapped again. An overvalued currency killed exports. Devaluation killed credibility. So when Nasser nationalized Suez, Eden saw it as an existential crisis. 2/3 of Europe's oil flowed through that canal. If Nasser could choke the canal, he could choke Britain's economy. The war wasn't about prestige. It was about survival. But here's what Eden missed. The real choke point wasn't the Suez Canal. It was the Federal Reserve. It was the US Treasury. It was the $3 billion in British bonds that America could dump at will. Nasser controlled the waterway. Eisenhower controlled Britain's credit line. And in 1956, credit was more powerful than geography. Lord Haverstock's mistake was believing the estate's magnificence made him wealthy. Britain's mistake was believing the empire's size made it powerful. Wealth isn't assets. Wealth is liquidity. Power isn't territory. Power is solvency. Britain owned a palace. America owned the mortgage. And when the payment came due, the palace didn't matter. Every dying empire has its priesthood. The guardians of orthodoxy who mistake ritual for reality. In Britain, That priesthood lived in the Treasury, the Mandarin's career civil servants who managed the nation's finances with Victorian moral certainty. They believed in soundness, balanced budgets, stable currency, fiscal discipline. These weren't just policies, they were virtues. Devaluation was weakness. Deficit spending was sin. Inflation was moral decay. This ideology made sense in 1890, when Britain ruled a quarter of the world and the pound was backed by limitless colonial wealth. It made no sense in 1956 when Britain was borrowing from America to pay for yesterday's empire. But the Treasury priests couldn't see the difference. They worshipped the pound as if its value were a moral judgment on British character. In the cabinet, this ideology became policy. Anthony Eden, the gentleman diplomat, son of a landed aristocrat, embodied the contradiction. He'd spent his career in the Foreign Office, not the Treasury. He understood power as diplomatic prestige and military force. He didn't understand power as balance sheets and currency flows. When Eden looked at Suez, he saw Munich. He saw Chamberlain's appeasement. He saw the lesson that dictators must be confronted, not negotiated with. This wasn't wrong. It was incomplete. Eden saw the strategic dimension Nasser as a Soviet proxy threatening Western interests. He missed the financial dimension, Britain as a debtor threatening American interests. Harold Macmillan, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, should have known better. Macmillan was a publisher, not a banker. But he'd served in the Treasury long enough to read a balance sheet. In the planning stages, Macmillan supported the war. He told Cabinet, "We must act decisively." He believed, like Eden, that British credibility required action. He believed America would support Britain once the operation succeeded. He was catastrophically wrong. The cabinet minutes from September 1956 reveal the delusion. One minister asks, "Can we afford this operation?" Macmillan responds, "We cannot afford not to act. Our position in the Middle East, our oil supplies, our standing as a great power all depend on controlling Suez. No one asks, what if America opposes us? No one calculates, how long can we sustain military operations if sterling comes under pressure? No one considers, what happens if the Americans dump our bonds?" This wasn't stupidity. This was ideological blindness. The Conservative Party's entire identity rested on imperial greatness. Churchill's wartime rhetoric, "We shall never surrender," still echoed. The party that had saved civilization from Hitler couldn't admit that victory had bankrupted the nation. So they built a fantasy. They convinced themselves that prestige alone could maintain Britain's position, that other nations would respect British power because they always had, that the Americans, grateful for British support in 2 world wars, would never truly turn on their closest ally. Meanwhile, American intelligence was reading Britain's mail. CIA reports from 1956 show clinical assessments of British weakness. UK foreign exchange reserves critically low. Defense spending unsustainable at current levels. Sterling area increasingly fragile. Military action in Middle East would trigger financial crisis. Eisenhower knew Britain was bluffing with empty chips. He knew Eden was operating on borrowed time and borrowed money. And he knew exactly how to exploit it. The cultural dimension deepened the trap. Britain's elite had been educated in a world where the empire was permanent. Eton and Harrow taught Latin and Greek, not economics and industrial management. The Foreign Office recruited diplomats who could quote Thucydides but couldn't read a corporate earnings report. This made Britain's leadership brilliant at 19th century statecraft and blind to 20th century realities. They understood balance of power politics. They didn't understand balance of payments crises. They could negotiate treaty protocols. They couldn't navigate currency markets. Eden's generation had watched Britain stand alone against Hitler in 1940. They'd seen the empire mobilize millions of soldiers from India, Africa, Australia. They'd witnessed Britain's finest hour. But 1940's greatness had been purchased with 1950's poverty. Every pound spent on the war was a pound borrowed from the future. Now the future had arrived with collection notices. The comparison to other empires is instructive. Rome after the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD still looked magnificent. The legions still existed. The Senate still met. The roads and aqueducts still functioned. But the treasury was empty. The frontiers were collapsing. Within a generation, Rome fell. Spain, after the destruction of the Armada in 1588, still ruled a global empire. Spanish silver still flowed from the Americas. Spanish power still dominated European politics, but the wars in the Netherlands had drained the treasury. The silver paid interest to foreign bankers. Within 50 years, Spain became a second-rate power. Britain, after Suez, looked the same. The empire still existed on maps. The military still deployed globally. The pound still functioned as a reserve currency. But the reserves were empty. The debts were compounding. The creditor was hostile. What Eden and the Treasury priests couldn't accept was that symbols and substance had divorced. Britain had the symbols of power, the bases, the fleets, the diplomatic protocols. But power itself, the ability to act without permission, had migrated to Washington. The pound was prestigious. The dollar was liquid. Prestige without liquidity is a title without an estate, a uniform without an army, a currency without reserves. And when Eisenhower threatened to dump Britain's bonds, he wasn't attacking Britain's military. He was attacking Britain's illusion. The illusion that prestige could substitute for solvency, that history could outweigh arithmetic, that a great power could remain great while bankrupt. The Treasury priests had worshipped the wrong god. They'd protected the pound's value while the nation's wealth evaporated. They defended fiscal orthodoxy while the empire collapsed. They preserved the symbol while the substance died. And at Suez, the bill came due. November 6, 1956, the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. 20 men sit around a table deciding the fate of an empire. At the head sits Anthony Eden, exhausted, chain-smoking, his hands trembling from a combination of amphetamines and sleeping pills his doctors have prescribed for stress. He has barely slept in 3 weeks. British troops control Port Said. The military operation is succeeding. And Harold Macmillan is about to tell him it's all over. Macmillan stands and distributes a single-page memo. The numbers are simple enough for anyone to understand. Current foreign exchange reserves, $2,750 million. Daily reserve loss due to sterling sales, $45 million. Days until reserves are exhausted at current rate, 61 days. But that assumes the hemorrhaging stays constant. It won't. If the United States dumps $3 billion in UK bonds, the rate will accelerate. Reserve exhaustion, 14 days. Perhaps less. Macmillan speaks carefully, each word measured. Prime Minister, we face a binary choice. We can maintain our position in Egypt and watch the pound collapse within a fortnight. Or we can announce an immediate ceasefire and withdrawal. There is no third option. Eden's face flushes red. We are not cowards. We are not appeasers. I did not spend my entire career fighting Hitler's aggression only to surrender to an Egyptian colonel. Macmillan doesn't flinch. This isn't about courage, Prime Minister. This is about mathematics. We have fought and won. But we cannot afford victory. Eden slams his hand on the table. What you're describing is national humiliation. We invaded Egypt to restore order. Now you want us to withdraw with our tail between our legs. What message does that send to the world? Selwyn, Lloyd the Foreign Secretary tries to mediate. Perhaps we can negotiate a face-saving formula with the United Nations. Withdraw our forces but ensure international control of the canal. Turn military success into diplomatic achievement. Eden turns on him. Selwyn, Nasser nationalized the canal illegally. We acted to restore international law. If we withdraw now, revalidate his theft. Every tin pot dictator from Baghdad to Jakarta will learn the lesson. Seize British assets and we'll do nothing. Macmillan interrupts. Prime Minister, with respect, Nasser is irrelevant to our current crisis. The threat isn't coming from Cairo. It's coming from Washington. President Eisenhower has made his position clear. Withdraw or face financial destruction. He's not bluffing. Eden's voice rises to a shout. Then let him try. We are Great Britain. We defeated Napoleon. We defeated the Kaiser. We defeated Hitler. And now you want me to surrender to Dwight Eisenhower because of some bonds? The room falls silent. R.A. Butler, the Home Secretary, and Eden's longtime rival speaks quietly. Anthony, we didn't defeat Hitler. America and Russia defeated Hitler. We survived Hitler, and surviving cost us everything. We've been living on American loans for 11 years. That charity has expired. Eden looks around the table, searching for allies. He finds none. Every man in the room supported the war 3 weeks ago. Now every face shows the same resignation. Lord Salisbury, the Lord President of the Council, an aristocrat whose family had dominated British politics for generations, delivers the final blow. Prime Minister, my ancestor Robert Cecil negotiated with Elizabeth I. Another ancestor served under Queen Anne. My family has guided this nation through 4 centuries, and I am telling you, we are no longer a first-rank power. We are a secondary nation pretending to be an empire. Suez has exposed what we've been hiding for a decade. The choice is not between humiliation and victory. The choice is between controlled retreat and total collapse. Eden stands abruptly, walks to the window. Outside, London is dark, a reminder that even street lighting is rationed due to the oil crisis. When he speaks again, his voice is hollow. I spent my entire career in the Foreign Office. I resigned in 1938 because Chamberlain was too weak to confront Hitler. I've built my reputation on one principle: appeasement fails, strength succeeds. And now you're asking me to appease Nasser. Macmillan walks over, stands beside him. Anthony, look at the numbers. We have $2.7 billion in reserves. We owe $30 billion in total debts. We're spending 10% of our economy on defense. We're fighting colonial wars on 4 continents. We're maintaining a reserve currency with reserves that cover 10% of our liabilities. This isn't sustainable. It's never been sustainable. We've been living in a financial fantasy since 1945. Suez didn't create our crisis. Suez revealed it. Eden turns to face him. Then what was the point? What was the point of defeating Hitler if we end up as America's client state? What was the point of saving civilization if we lose our independence? Macmillan's response is brutal in its honesty. There was no point, Prime Minister. We won the war and lost our empire. That's the trade we made. We can either accept it now, with some dignity intact, or we can fight it and lose everything: currency, economy, credibility, in a fortnight. The cabinet meeting stretches past midnight. Eden fights every point. He proposes appealing to the British people, rallying national support through radio addresses. Macmillan reminds him, with what oil will people drive to work when reserves run dry? He suggests calling Eisenhower's bluff, daring America to destroy its closest ally. Butler reminds him, they're not bluffing. The CIA has been planning this for weeks. He proposes devaluing the pound to ease pressure. Macmillan reminds him, devaluation destroys the sterling area. 50 nations will abandon the pound overnight. Finally, at 1 a.m., Eden relents. Not because he's convinced, but because he has no choice. At 2 a.m., the cabinet votes unanimously to accept a ceasefire. At 6 a.m., the announcement is broadcast. By noon, sterling stabilizes. The hemorrhaging slows. Eden sits alone in his study and understands the truth. He won the war in Egypt, but he lost the war that mattered, the war for Britain's financial independence. Arithmetic had defeated Vanity, accountants had outvoted generals, and the empire died in a midnight cabinet meeting. The ceasefire stops the bleeding. It didn't heal the wound. Within weeks, the British government began a systematic audit of what the empire actually cost. The numbers were grotesque. February 1957. Defense Minister Duncan Sandys presents the Defense White Paper. Britain is spending £1,700 million annually on defense, 10% of GDP, 50% more than any NATO ally as a percentage of national income. The paper proposes radical cuts, end conscription, close 40 overseas bases within 5 years, reduce the army from 400,000 to 200,000 personnel, abandon Britain's commitment to fight land wars in Asia. This document has a name among historians: the beginning of the end of empire. But even these cuts aren't enough, because Britain isn't just paying for current defense, it's paying for past wars. The debt from World War II requires annual interest payments of £200 million. The American loan of 1946 requires £70 million annually. The wars in Malaya, Kenya, and Cyprus, still ongoing, drain another $150 million per year. Britain is on a debt treadmill. borrowing to pay interest on previous borrowing, borrowing to maintain bases that defend colonies that produce no profit, borrowing to project power that no longer influences outcomes. The empire has become a payday loan scheme. Here's how the mechanics worked. Britain borrowed from the United States to maintain the sterling area. The sterling area existed to give Britain access to colonial resources, but those resources, rubber from Malaya, copper from Rhodesia, tea from Ceylon, were purchased in pounds. Those pounds were then deposited back in London banks as sterling area reserves. Those reserves were liabilities, debts Britain owed. To service those debts, Britain needed hard currency, dollars. To get dollars, Britain needed to export manufactured goods to dollar-zone countries, but British manufacturing was outdated, bombed during the war, underinvested since. German and Japanese factories rebuilt with Marshall Plan aid were newer, more efficient. British exports couldn't compete, so Britain borrowed more dollars to cover the gap. Each loan increased the debt burden. Each debt payment required more exports or more borrowing. There was no escape velocity, only deeper capture. Now add the colonial wars. The Malayan Emergency, 1948 to 1960, cost Britain over £300 million, 40,000 British troops fighting communist insurgents in the jungle. The war was won militarily, but it drained resources that could have rebuilt British infrastructure. The Mau Mau Uprising in Kenya 1952 to 1952 to 1960 cost another £100 million. 20,000 troops deployed, detention camps, forced resettlement, brutal counterinsurgency. Britain won that war too, but Kenya gained independence anyway in 1963. The Cyprus Emergency, 1955 to 1959, cost £80 million, 15,000 troops fighting Greek Cypriot independence fighters. Cyprus gained independence in 1960. Britain kept 2 military bases. The bases cost £20 million annually to maintain. Do the math. Britain spent £80 million to fight a war to keep Cyprus. Cyprus became independent anyway. Britain now spends $20 million per year to maintain bases in an independent country that didn't want British occupation in the first place. This is the economics of empire in terminal decline. Every colonial war was a net loss. Every base was a liability. Every garrison was a drain on reserves needed to back the currency. But Britain couldn't stop, because abandoning bases would signal weakness. Weakness would undermine confidence in the pound. And the pound's credibility was all Britain had left. The physical infrastructure of Britain told the same story. By 1960, British roads were potholed relics. Hospitals operated with equipment from the 1930s. Schools were overcrowded and underfunded. Housing stock bombed. During the war remained unrepaired. Slums still existed in London, Liverpool, Manchester. Meanwhile, Germany and France were building modern motorways, hospitals, universities. Why? Because they weren't spending 10% of GDP on global military presence. Germany spent 4% on defense. France spent 7%. Both invested heavily in infrastructure and industry. Britain spent on the illusion of empire and got decay. Then came the brain drain. Between 1950 and 1960, over 10,000 scientists and engineers immigrated from Britain to the United States. They left because American universities paid better. American companies offered better research funding. American labs had better equipment. Britain was training talent and exporting it to the country that had replaced it as global hegemon. The Treasury tried various schemes to stop the bleeding. Import controls, limiting what British citizens could buy from abroad. Exchange controls limiting how much currency could be taken out of the country. Rationing. Sugar rationing didn't end until 1953, 8 years after the war. These weren't policies of a great power, these were policies of a siege economy, and still the debt accumulated. By 1960, Britain's total external debt exceeded £35 billion. Foreign exchange reserves remained around £3 billion. The ratio of liabilities to reserves had actually worsened since Suez. The 1967 devaluation was inevitable. On November 18, 1967, Prime Minister Harold Wilson announced the pound would be devalued from $2.8 to $2.4, a 14% reduction overnight. Wilson went on television and told the British people, "The pound in your pocket has not been devalued." This was technically true. A pound still bought a pound's worth of goods inside Britain, but it was economically absurd. The pound had just lost 14% of its international purchasing power. Imports would cost more. Inflation would rise. Living standards would fall, and the sterling area began its terminal collapse. Country after country abandoned the pound and switched reserves to dollars. By 1970, the sterling area was dead. The comparison to Soviet collapse is instructive. In the 1980s, the USSR maintained military parity with the United States. Troops in Eastern Europe, Afghanistan, Africa, Asia, nuclear weapons, space program, global intelligence network. The symbols of superpower status. But the economy was hollow. Defense spending consumed 25% of GDP. Consumer goods were scarce. Infrastructure crumbled. When oil prices fell in the mid-1980s, Soviet hard currency earnings collapsed. The empire couldn't afford itself. Within 5 years, it was gone. Britain's trajectory was slower, but structurally identical. Maintain imperial prestige while the economic base erodes. Fight colonial wars while infrastructure decays. Project power abroad while borrowing to survive at home. By 1960, Britain's share of global GDP had fallen from 10% in 1945 to 5%. By 1970, it was 3%. The empire that once ruled a quarter of humanity was becoming a mid-sized European economy, and it all began at Suez, the moment when arithmetic defeated vanity, when a bomb threat accomplished what no army could, when America proved that financial weapons could kill empires without firing a shot. November 18, 1967, 11 years after Suez, the pound is devalued from $2.8 to $2.4. The symbolic breaking point. For a century, the pound had been the world's reserve currency. Now it was a secondary asset, subordinate to the dollar. Countries holding sterling reserves dumped them immediately. Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Nigeria, former colonies that had kept pounds out of loyalty or inertia, switched to dollars. The sterling area, already dying, now received its death certificate. By 1970, it existed only on paper. By 1972, it was formally dissolved. The pound that once financed global trade now financed only British imports. August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announces the United States will no longer convert dollars to gold. The Bretton Woods system, the architecture that replaced British financial hegemony with American, collapses. The dollar, freed from gold, becomes pure fiat currency backed only by American economic power. Britain, which had struggled under Bretton Woods, now struggles in a world of floating exchange rates. The pound falls from $2.4 to below $2 by 1976, then to $1.7. Every decline makes imports more expensive. Every decline makes imports more expensive. Every decline fuels inflation. By 1976, inflation reaches 16% annually. The sick man of Europe era begins. September 1976, Britain goes to the IMF hat in hand, requesting a $3.9 billion bailout, the largest IMF loan in history at that time. The conditions are humiliating. Massive spending cuts, public sector layoffs, welfare reductions, tax increases. The IMF essentially takes control of British fiscal policy. A former empire now takes orders from international bureaucrats. Prime Minister James Callaghan tells the Labour Party conference, "We used to think you could spend your way out of recession. I tell you in all candor that option no longer exists." Translation: Britain no longer controls its own economic destiny. April 1982. Argentina invades the Falkland Islands. Britain, by now a diminished power, sends a task force 8,000 miles to reclaim the territory. The war lasts 74 days. Britain wins, but the fleet that sails south is a ghost of empire. 2 aircraft carriers, both old, both soon to be scrapped. Destroyers and frigates borrowed from NATO. Ammunition borrowed from the United States. Satellite intelligence provided by America. Logistical support from American bases. Britain won the Falklands War with American permission and American equipment. The military victory obscured the geopolitical reality. Britain could no longer project power independently. Every foreign military operation now required American approval. July 1997. Britain returns Hong Kong to China. The ceremony is dignified, carefully choreographed. Prince Charles reads a statement about enduring friendship. The Union Jack is lowered for the last time. but there's no pretense of strength. This isn't Britain choosing to withdraw. This is Britain honoring a lease that expired. A lease signed in 1898 when Britain could dictate terms to China. Now China is a nuclear power, a permanent UN Security Council member, soon to be the world's second largest economy. Britain returns Hong Kong because Britain has no choice. The last significant territory of empire is liquidated, not through war, through a contract's expiration date. 50 years after Suez, the British government declassifies cabinet papers from 1956. Historians discover the full details of Eisenhower's bond threat, the phone call, the ultimatum. The $3 billion held like a gun to Britain's head. For decades, the official story was that Britain withdrew from Suez due to UN pressure and moral considerations. The documents reveal the truth: financial coercion. America didn't persuade Britain to withdraw. America threatened Britain with economic annihilation. The reassessment begins. Suez wasn't a military defeat. It was a financial execution, the moment when America demonstrated that bond markets were more powerful than battlefields, that creditors could destroy empires without firing a shot, that in the modern world, liquidity was sovereignty. Historians start connecting dots. The 1967 devaluation, downstream effect of Suez's reserve hemorrhaging, the 1976 IMF crisis, consequence of decades of imperial overstretch post-Suez. The Falklands dependency on American logistics, result of defense cuts triggered by Suez. Hong Kong's handover, inevitable after Suez proved Britain couldn't defend distant territories against great power opposition. Every British humiliation after 1956 traces back to that phone call, to Eisenhower's cold calculus, to the realization that Britain was no longer an independent great power but an American client state. The counterfactual haunts strategic thinkers. What if Britain had called Eisenhower's bluff? What if Eden had refused to withdraw? The Treasury's assessment was clear: 14 days until bankruptcy. But what if they were wrong? What if Eisenhower was bluffing? What if America wouldn't really destroy Britain's economy over Egypt? The answer is, we'll never know. Because Britain blinked, and in geopolitics, the side that blinks first loses forever. Empire died because accountants outvoted generals. Because arithmetic defeated vanity. Because when forced to choose between prestige and solvency, Britain chose survival. In survival as a secondary power, Suez taught two lessons. Britain learned prestige is not liquidity. You can own territories, command armies, and chair international conferences. But if your reserves are empty and your creditor is hostile, you have no power. You have the costume of power without the substance, the uniform without the army, the currency without the backing. America learned hegemons are made in bond markets, not battlefields. Eisenhower didn't need to invade Britain to end its empire. He didn't need a single soldier. He just needed to threaten a bond sale. The imperial succession happened without a shot fired. The dollar replaced sterling through financial coercion, not military conquest. This is the architecture of modern power. Control the reserve currency, control the international financial institutions, control the credit lines of allied nations, and you control those nations more completely than any colonial governor ever could. The modern parallel is unavoidable. America today holds over $35 trillion in debt. China holds over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. If China dumped those bonds, would America face a Suez moment? Or has America's position issuer of the global reserve currency, with the Federal Reserve able to print unlimited dollars, made it immune to the trap that killed Britain? The question haunts strategists in Washington and Beijing. Because empires always believe they're different. Britain thought its empire was eternal. Rome thought its legions were invincible. Spain thought its silver fleet was inexhaustible. All empires die. Most die slowly, denying reality until arithmetic forces recognition. Britain's final lesson is universal. Empires die when accountants outvote generals. When creditors become more powerful than allies. When the cost of prestige exceeds the capacity to pay. Suez was the phone call that ended an empire. The bond threat that killed a superpower. The moment when financial weapons proved more lethal than military force. And the warning that no empire past, present, or future